Welcome, everybody, to PTV's Progressive Farming with Evan Folds. I am not Evan Folds. My name is Josiah Longford, and I am the moderator for today's show. Um, every week, Evan Folds gets on and talks about all kinds of things, soil, plants. Today's episode is compost tea, and we're really excited to dive into today's episode. Remember, you can head over to tv.permaethos.com to watch the last episodes. Also on YouTube, the Permaethos channel on YouTube. You can subscribe and watch the latest episodes on there as well. If you want to see all of the old episodes, head over to learn.permaethos.com and support the show for $29 a year. And you get access to all of the shows and direct access to Evan himself for any questions you might have. Let's go ahead and begin, Evan. Thanks for being here.
Of course. Let me share my screen here.
Oh, hey guys, if you haven't been to one of these before, you'll see a Q&A button. So Evan will be presenting for about an hour on Compost Tea today. And if you hit that Q&A button, any questions you have during the show, go ahead and ask them. And then afterwards, we do a Q&A session. So we'll stick around and answer any questions you might have.
Absolutely. Thanks as always, Josiah. This is a fun one for me. I've got a deep level of experience in compost tea, and one of the things that I try to get across is the reality that the further we look into the biological world, microbial world to be more direct, the more there is to discover. You know, there's stats like we know 5% of bacteria, 10% of fungi at the rate of discovery. So in a very real sense, any sort of authority brought to a subject like that has to be taken with a grain of salt. So that's my disclaimer, right? I'm not going to present to you in a way that is from on high. You know, I'm really simply trying to stimulate some imagination towards it, really. And I think that's the most important thing, because the reality that we can take to the bank is that the soil is not soil unless it's diverse, represented by diverse microorganisms, and is an organism in and of itself, right? And this is a principle that I take from biodynamic agriculture, which treats the farm as an organism. And in the same spirit, the earth is an organism, and it breathes through the equinoxes. You know, it breathes in the winter, breathes out in the summer, to simplify it. You know, it's like a human. Like, we can't continue to breathe in, right? There's a rhythm, and it's unconscious. And at the same time, it can be worked with, right? So, you know, and if you want to take that all the way to the end, you know, what is breath, right? It's the manna. It's the thing that sustains our life. And the fact that it's not front and center is a blessing, because imagine if we had to try to breathe all day. It'd be quite cumbersome. But the point that I'm driving towards here is that the soil food web, as it's called, as we've kind of covered in, you know, the soil food web 2 weeks ago, and composting, you know, last week, is that the soil food web is totally dynamic. You can't measure it. You know, we talked about humus, you know, and that study that came out that said, you know, humus doesn't exist. And the point of it was to sensationalize it in some respects, and it worked, because people got really enamored with this concept of, you know, what does that mean? And the point is that the only way we have to develop a measurement towards humus in the soil is to take it out of the soil to look at it, which takes it out of its native environment. And it's like, you know, taking our heart out of our body to try to study how it works in the body, right? Crude example maybe, but it's true. We have to break it apart in order to identify it and to measure it in the ways that we've decided are enough from a scientific standpoint in a lot of ways. And I think one of the things I'm very interested in pushing forward is the idea that, you know, that's half the story. And what creeps into that reality is imagination. And, you know, metaphor and analogy and those sorts of things are you know, tools to paint a picture verbally and situationally, so that we can kind of imagine what it is that we're working with. And I give you an example I've mentioned often, primarily because it was a lot of boot camp for me. I owned a retail garden center for 15 years and, basically consulted the general public in these kinds of contexts. And it never ceased to amaze me how many people came through the door for the first time that had never had a moment where they thought about the soil being alive to begin with, which is kind of amazing. I've got a really pesky fly in here, so pardon me if I'm swatting at nothing. I don't know if you can see that, but you know how that is, right? Good gracious. So point is, soil food web is dynamic. It is really misunderstood. We should be learning that the soil is alive in first grade directly. And that's a lot of what drives my energy in all of this, is trying to spread the good word about the things that I've been humbly and appreciatively able to learn over the years from other people and through a lot of hard work. And, hopefully, we can get some questions answered and stimulate some more, because, as soon as that ends, it stops being fun, right? So compost tea is not something you drink. That question comes up a lot, right? In some ways, compost tea is a really poor name for what it is, but it's stuck and it's hard to get away from. So, some vernacular within that, compost tea is a living solution. It's got diverse microbes that operate in a web of life, not unlike the ocean, where you got the plankton to the shark. Well, in the food web, which we've covered in past weeks, and you should go check the videos out if you haven't. And as Josiah said, really appreciate the support. The $29 a year will give you unlimited access to everything that we've talked about before 3 weeks ago, or 3 sessions ago, I believe. So, do spread the word about what we're doing. And if you learn something cool, man, definitely appreciate your support. So this food web is beyond our ability to measure. And, you can see this is an image of a beneficial nematode and a protozoa over there on the left. And it looks like he's got caught on some organic matter there, but what they're doing is looking for bacteria and fungi to eat. So these organisms are sustained by the presence of the smaller organisms. Again, you can see the analogy for the ocean very directly. The whales die when the plankton die, right? Everybody knows that, but so does everything else, including maybe us. So these things are vitally important. And what's missing in conventional agriculture and mainstream agriculture now is a direct arena of respect for the life in the soil. What organic gardening and growing has become is using organic fertilizers. And in reality, that's just simply a way maybe to get a better result. You're going to pay more for it. It's not scalable in some respects. So that story about organics is true. What's missing is that it's not enough to just use organic fertilizers in dead soil. In that respect, you're still just fertilizing your plants. You're not growing the soil's capacity to be soil. That only comes through the work of microorganisms and the diversity they bring. Again, back to that analogy, you try drinking a beer without yeast, or eating cheese or bread or what have you. The microbe makes and defines the soil environment. Otherwise, it's just dirt, however you want to think about it. So the scale of this thing is a lot of why we don't pay attention to it. Not everybody has access to watch videos like this nematode, right? But as soon as you start to see this thing move around and make the connection, you can't see this with your naked eye. It gets real in a different way. And we would put a loop of some of these videos up in the store and just point to it and say, look, watch that for a second and think about it. Really internalize. There's a new universe in the soil, right? And for these people that have walked in and never thought about it before. And it's really exciting for people. I'm handing them a gallon of brown water. They don't know what it is. They can, understand that it's alive, but they can't see it, right? And this is what ends up with people thinking microbes are hand sanitizer and antibiotics. There's a level of fear around it that really doesn't deserve the level of fear we provided for it as a society. There's far more beneficial microbes than there are parasitic. So, this video is kind of interesting. It shows a flea and a bacteria that is, so that in the image there right here is a bacteria, and that's a flea. So it gives you some level of scale of what kind of level we're working on. That bacteria is on the eye of the flea, or I don't even know if that's an eye. It's probably not. I don't know what that is. whatever a flea has on his head that looks like that. But the point is, it's really, really, really small. Up to 500,000 bacteria can fit in the period in the end of a sentence in a book. So the scale of this thing is off the charts, and it's not surprising people don't have a healthy respect for them, and it's not surprising that we don't know as much as we'd like to know about them. Frankly, it's going to be the future of agriculture as it is in medicine. The next hurdle after that is to bring in the life force and the spiritual component of living systems that biodynamics champions. And that's part of what I call bioenergetic agriculture that addresses the physical, mineral, biological, and energetic capacities of a living system. So what we're talking about here is the biological realm. We've since talked about the physical realm and the mineral realm. And, you know, microbes are front and center, right? They should be the focus of organic agriculture. There's nothing within the mandate of what certified organic agriculture is that says diverse microbes should be present. And that's really one of the limitations of the current organic posture. It's just about using clean materials, which is great. Don't get me wrong, it's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't define the opportunity that things like compost tea can bring you within your gardening and in your farming. So, you know, within that reality, got another video here. Hopefully it'll, yeah. So, you know, we'll skip this one, but the point that I like to make is, you know, what does $1 trillion look like? Let's look at it anyway. It's not that long. It's, you know, trying to articulate the scale that we're working on here is very difficult. So this is just another way.
Well, let me tell you something about us, this country. If you spent $1 a second, you wouldn't hit $1 trillion for 32,500 years. And if you spent $1 million a day since the birth of Christ, you wouldn't be at $1 trillion. And the Big Bang Theory of the universe happened 13,600,000,000 years ago. That ain't even close to $1 trillion. We owe 16 of those babies.
So reference. Yeah.
And then you're going to borrow 3,600,000,000 a day, every day. You're going to do that today, tomorrow. Every buck you spend, you borrow 41 cents. And I would say, well, one of you, let a peep out of yourself of what you're going to do about that.
So there you go, guys. The national debt in an infographic. And the connection there is simply scale. You know, it's really difficult for us to really come to terms with orders of magnitude separate from how we experience life, right? And I find that, you know, any way that you can kind of engineer to make that point is helpful, because it stretches us a little bit and it allows us to have respect for levels of life that we don't experience on a daily basis. And, you know, this is a true fact. There's nothing alive smaller than bacteria. It is the smallest form of autonomous life, singular-celled organisms, the original organisms on Earth, before the tree of life differentiated and presented us with the wonders of what we deal with in nature today. So I've shown you this before, and it's worth looking at again because it sets the table for some of the things that we're going to talk about. Today we're talking mostly about compost tea and the capacity of what it is, not necessarily how to use it. We're going to cover that next week. And I'm going to give you different methods next week, and we're going to get a little more action oriented. This week is really about setting the table so that we can think through it all the way clearly, because there's some common misconceptions in the compost tea conversation that I'll run through. So, you know, this infographic is showing you that organic matter doesn't just melt. It's biologically digested and consumed by different life levels, or what are called trophic levels. And you got the bacteria and the fungi, the primary consumers or cyclers. Then you got the secondary consumers, the nematodes, the protozoa, the mites, the things that are eating the bacteria and the fungi. And then you've got the arthropods and the things that we can see regularly that we have a lot of respect for. You know, when you see biodiversity present in a garden or in a compost pile, you know that things are happening. I tell that story about people wanting to throw earthworms on their garden that they've been using Roundup on and to get rid of the weeds, and they've been killing the soil with all kinds of different toxic rescue chemistry, and they want to throw worms in the mix. And I should add, propping up with fertilizer. You can grow plants in peat moss and perlite if you wanted to. That's what hydroponic growing is, for that matter. So it's not difficult to grow plants with fertilizers. What we're talking about here is growing the soil. And you can do both at one time and wean yourself off the need to bring the fertilizer over time, which is where you really experience the cost benefit of organic growing, and where you kind of step out of the vehicle of the common misconception that organics is more expensive. It's not. It's actually a lot less expensive when you do the math on all of the problems you mitigate before they rear their head. So within that understanding, compost tea can be accomplished in a couple of different ways. We're going to look into the specific methods more next week, but these are kind of the two that live in my world. You have compost tea here on the right. You can do that in a 5-gallon bucket. You can grow microbes. It's a pretty simple process. We make what's called the microbe maker compost tea system, and it creates circulation that, rather than exposing oxygen to the solution through an air stone by surface area, breaking the bubbles up, if you will, we're doing it through circulation. So we're exposing the skin of the solution and then sucking it into the solution. And you can achieve higher dissolved oxygen. You can actually achieve higher dissolved oxygen retention, which is something that we'll cover a little bit more next week, but it's not normally talked about in compost tea conversations. And that's really important. You don't have to put an air stone in a river, right? Because you're exposing the skin of the water and you're sucking it in. This is why we have fountains and retention ponds to aerate and what have you. Compost tea, in that respect, you can see these are the two different brewers. You can brew in a 5-gallon bucket passively, and you can actively circulate. And these are more commercial units that we would sell to landscapers or farmers, larger scale farmers or garden centers, that kind of thing, for tea distribution. So this is a lot of what I do with my day job, I guess, if you will, with Progressive Farms. You can visit our website at microbemakers.com if you want to take a look around. So here's some quick definitions of compost tea. It's not really a definable substance, all right? So this is really more for just top of mind understanding. Come up with your own definition. The reality is, just like in a compost pile, if all of us listening here created a compost pile out of the materials around us, they'd all be different. We got one word for it, right? We're not going to call it Evan compost and that mean anything, because frankly, the next pile that I make is going to be different, right? That concept is really difficult for modern science from a scientific method standpoint to handle. If it can't be defined and replicated, it doesn't exist in some ways. And that's one of the reasons it doesn't reach our imagination through school, because school is very conditioned to conditioning people, let me say. And not all in a bad way. It's just only going to teach you what is definable and replicable, right? What we can make a diagram out of in a book. What's easy for us to understand based on what we experience. But as you know, when you start getting into the speed of light and orders of magnitude and of separation with microbes and these sorts of things, it becomes really difficult to present it in any kind of real way that shows you the value. And that's part of, I'll say, the difficulty of what I do is that people want the type of peer-reviewed study that they would expect using a chemical in lawn care. And unfortunately, I don't have the resources to carry that burden. And I don't know of any universities that have put the effort into doing that. And even if they did, they would have to be using a branded material in order to replicate that in some way. So what you end up with is very limited biological products. I mean, the study that showed that molasses was not a good ingredient in compost tea was done in a way that they put aerobic E. coli in a vial with molasses and they shook it. They didn't document the DO. They didn't present any sort of competition to that E. coli. And, the E. coli replicated and grew in the presence of the molasses. And then they published a study that said molasses is no good for compost tea. Well, the reality is E. coli is not an enemy. It's just a part of the food web. Now, it has a mode of action that influences us negatively at concentration, but that's defined by the inferior conditions that are created on a farm where, the spinach is exposed to it because there's a feedlot next to it or whatever it may be. It's not the E. coli's fault. So, when you really come to these terms and you look past the veil of kind of the headline, if you will, this is a very comfortable process. I can tell you that I've been doing this for about 15 years, compost tea. And I've distributed, I can't tell you how many thousands of gallons out of a garden center personally, and we have maybe 100 dealers that do that in their garden centers. Never once have we had someone say that it harmed their garden in any way, shape, or form. And we actually do what's called perpetual brewing, which we'll talk about a little more in depth next week, that keeps a brew going kind of like a kombucha. You know, if you put 5 gallons of water in the unit, you put a unit of the 5-gallon recipe and you keep the brew going. That's against the grain of best practices in compost tea, which is a batch brewing approach. You brew it up to use it, and then you do it again next week, which frankly is the way you should do it if you're not a garden center, because you know how much tea you need, you brew it up, you use it, and then you start another batch when you need it. For a garden center, you got to get everybody to show up on the right day. Or if you batch brew every day, you got to sell everything you had from the day before, and it doesn't work like that, right? People just aren't going to show up. They're busy, or they say they will, they won't. Not enough people show up, whatever the case may be. So, I invented that actually out of my garden center because I couldn't figure out how to get everybody there on the right day, and we've been doing that for over a decade. If you go to the experts in compost tea and say this is what we're doing, they'd call you crazy and give you all the reasons why you can't. But I can point you to thousands of happy people that have experienced it. So again, that's a small window into the lack of authority that exists within the compost tea conversation. I think if we're humbler to that, we're going to be able to discover a lot more ways to work with this. And frankly, even if it's not 100% ideal, I'm not sure how you would define that, but say it's 85%. It's still getting us down the road. It's still inoculating the tea. It's giving people an experience on the power of living microbes, which you can see in 1 to 2 to 3 applications in any application. And then the soil has an engine to be what it is and can produce fertilizer for you for free, literally. So, compost tea, if you defined it through Google, is a liquid produced by extracting bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and nematodes from compost. It's really a poor definition. That's defining what's called an extract. So let me create some vernacular here. Actively aerated compost tea is when you're bringing aeration to a solution, adding microbes, and then using organic fertilizers as a food source. And in the presence of food and oxygen, the microbes grow to extraordinary concentrations. An extract is akin to what you would get out of the spigot on a worm bin, or that would come through the compost pile, and if you have a bin, maybe the base of it catches the moisture that comes out of it. That's a valuable material. It's got microbes in it. They're dormant more than they are active because they haven't been aerated and fed aggressively. But the important thing is, while it's still a valuable solution, it's nowhere near the concentration of microbes you can accomplish when you're aerating the water and you're feeding them concentrated organic materials like molasses and fish and kelp and all kinds of different things like that. So, to say that an extract is the same thing as aerated compost tea is not a fair assessment. So, one of the definitions that we use, partner of mine, Bill, coined it, is liquid humus with minerals and nutrients added. The only limitation that I see there is that it doesn't represent the living microbe part of it. It does clarify the fact that compost tea is a double-edged sword. You're getting the living component that you can't buy from a shelf, because anytime you put compost tea in a bottle and put it on a shelf, there's a lot of products that are made that way. It's going to be dead, biologically within 2 to 3 days. But it doesn't make it a bad product because microbes make perfect plant food, right? So what you've got is an engine in a concentrated environment where microbes are cycling soluble and unrefined organic materials into a form that plants can use. That's what microbes do. Those leaves that fall in the forest, they don't melt. The tree can't eat the leaf. It can eat the repercussion of the biological activity that occurs breaking that down chemically into humus, which is then built back up into the living organism. So all we're doing is really leveraging that process. It is a concentration of compost tea is. I like to paint that picture with the leaves falling in the forest and that being the natural process that we're looking to stimulate. Composting concentrates that reality by focusing on it more, balancing the carbon to nitrogen as we talked about last week, turning it effectively, not too much, but enough to increase the oxygen content to stimulate the process. So we're concentrating that for human benefit. Compost tea takes that a whole another order of magnitude towards microbial concentration by growing the microbe actively, which is why you need to wait a 12 to 24-hour period before you distribute it. So again, we're going to get into some of the guts of that. But I wanted to kind of show you some of the limitations on the ability to find compost tea. I think it helps kind of in arrears understand why maybe there's not as much talked about and known about it. It's absolutely possible to make inferior compost tea. A lot of people that would make compost tea out of the compost they're making at their house wouldn't have a whole lot of success with it because they hadn't inoculated the microbes to begin with, what we covered last week. They're making mulch, right? They're oxidizing the material, and the diversity of, there's microbes there, but the diversity of microbes, of soil microbes that we want to be stimulating in the soil and in our agriculture just simply aren't present. So, with that being said, a really good analogy for compost tea is an aquarium. It's really no different. And this is one way I can kind of create a connection with people who've never heard of it before. A lot of people have had an aquarium, but everybody understands you have to aerate the water so the fish can breathe, right? All we're doing with compost tea is aerating it so the microbes can breathe. And that aeration is really critical to compost tea. If you're steeping, like maybe you've heard of nettle tea or comfrey tea or some anaerobic process that wouldn't use an air stone, and you're steeping this material, and you can make an extract that way too. You can just soak compost or even manure. And what you're doing there, the manure is not in a form that plants can use yet other than the soluble parts. So all you're really doing with a manure tea is extracting the soluble parts of the manure so you can spray it out. And there's no harm in that, but there's no biological relevance there. When you're making a comfrey or a nettle tea or something along those lines, you're steeping that in the water like you would in tea. And you're extracting the nutritional value of that material into the water, not just because it's been ground up, but because anaerobic microbes that operate without oxygen digest that material. But those anaerobic microbes, some of them are, because the facultative nature of going back and forth between aerobic and anaerobic is possible for certain species of microbes. But for the most part, you're stimulating anaerobic microbes that aren't very valuable other than for nutrient extraction. In other words, if you're using EM or some anaerobic grokashi, something like that, you're getting a benefit because those microbes are able to extract nutrition out of the organic matter that's there, but they're not capable of building humus and growing the soil's capacity to be soil. Soil is at its peak when it's aerated, which is why compacted soils are so negative and why we have to turn the compost pile and aerate a compost tea. So the parallels there make it pretty plain to see that what we're wanting to encourage is the aerated form of these microbes. So these microbes create humus. They are the central focus of compost tea. They make plant food. And you get both of those benefits from tea. So, just a window into a recipe, for example, this earth compound we make from 4 different sources of microbes. We're seeking diversity. It's got worm castings, a biodynamic compost, an organic compost, some archaea microbes, and we influence that with the biodynamic preparations. Biodynamics is a method of making compost that is energetic in its capacity. And I'm going to save the explanation of that until we can get into it in future weeks. But safe to say that you can't brew compost tea without microbes, right? So source something that's farm-based. If you can list the type of microbes that are in your inoculant, it's a limited product, doesn't make it a bad product. It just means it's designed for a certain mode of application, not for growing soil. The only way that we can do that, again, back to the 5% of bacteria, 10% of fungi that we know based on the rate of discovery, you can't choose the microbes and grow the soil. And the same thing occurs if you recall back from our mineral conversations. We can choose the elements that grow a plant effectively. We do that in hydroponics all the time. But the question becomes, what are we missing? And the trace elements that are involved in processes that we don't even understand and may never are restricted by the law of the minimum on a whole. So why would Mother Nature make an element not needed in the garden, right? Why would Mother Nature make a soil microbe not needed in the soil? So our effort should be about diversity, and what you'll find in compost tea is it's a very cost-effective and direct way of making sure that the microbes are present in diversity and that you can check that box. So, you could add, some microbes with, some molasses and some bat guano and some kelp and brew that up for 12 to 24 hours and grow microbes to a concentration that nature would never even be able to produce on her own. And that's really what allows us to play catch up. So I like to use the analogy of construction workers. The microbes are the construction workers. They are the organisms that put everything together. You can imagine if you hired a bunch of construction workers to build a neighborhood and gave them half the tools, how effective would they be, right? Gave them half the materials, how effective would they be? They could do a lot of work. They'd have to work a lot harder to do it. And that reality manifests indirectly into pest, disease, and a lot of the things that we fight as symptoms. So, this analogy for me, it makes a lot of sense. And I add one layer on that I don't typically see in the compost tea conversation that I think is important. So the microbes are construction workers. The organic matter and the fertilizers and the food sources that we're bringing are the building materials, right? So what happens when we bring a bunch of building materials to the process and we don't have any workers there to put it together? Well, in treating this analogy with some level of respect, because it's not perfect, we're going to continue to bring those materials to compensate for the fact that people can't put them together. So, in this analogy, you've got the construction workers. The purpose of organic fertilizers is not from an angle, not that I'm against it, but it's not a Mother Earth News crowd kind of scenario or expectation. It's not about healing the earth directly. That's a residual benefit of this approach. It is about using the form of material that microbes can grow from. And the more we encourage that, the stronger the soil becomes, the more mature it is, the more success we have, the less we need to spend chasing our symptoms around. And we can grow ourselves into a capacity where the soil can grow for us. That is an achievable endeavor, much more so in soil that's really higher quality. Around me, we've got a beach, so it takes some time to grow that soil. But I can tell you, when we had a lawn care company in town 6-8 years ago now, we had clients that had our service, and we'd hit them once a month with tea. And after a couple seasons, you could see a line down the property line where we hadn't been applying, and you could actually see the soil that we grew compared to the people that were using whatever they were doing. They weren't doing what we were doing, and there was nobody else doing it. They were using ChemLawn or using some kind of Scotch weed and feed or whatever it might be. But you could actually see the capacity in the soil. And not only that, you could do a soil probe and see the roots go all the way through the soil zone on ours and not others. It's really an impressive thing to see. So if you start to use compost tea, set yourself up in awareness of what it looks like to start, because you'll forget, take a picture, do whatever it is that you want to do, but track it over time and let the process prove itself to you. So this is an image just to kind of give you a window into the microscopic posture of compost, I got from Soil Food Web Institute. And it's 2,000 times magnification. There's all kinds of interesting things going on here. I'm not going to claim to know exactly what these things are, but any attempt I can bring to show the complexity of what it is that we're looking at. You can imagine looking at the same image of something like Miracle-Gro or some kind of synthetic fertilizer. It's not a lot of complexity, right? There's not a lot of tractionable life force for that system to build itself from. We're left with that responsibility to continue growing our plants. So the thing that I bring to this conversation that I think is somewhat unique is, in my experience, looking out into the wild world of compost tea, is trace elements. And these are really the tools, right? So that analogy really works. If you're hiring microbes to build a house, they got the building materials, but you're giving them half the tools or you're giving them inferior tools, they're going to have to work a lot harder to get the job done. And that is kind of an easy way to, consider some of the components of the concept of compost tea to have the most success. So, microbes plus food sources plus trace elements equals high quality compost tea. And I would add diverse microbes to that statement as well. It's not just about singular microbes. So I want to spend a minute on trace elements, because this is something that I like to highlight and that I think has a high level of value in regards to the potential of success in compost tea. We make a product called Earth Tonic, and it's a sea mineral catalyst, sea mineral fertilizer, really. I call it a catalyst in the compost tea because, you can see we kind of did the Verizon commercial in an infographic here where you got a typical fertilizer. I believe it was maybe Miracle-Gro, or I think actually this was a hydroponic fertilizer. And you can see the blue is the elemental spectrum there. And look at what Earth Tonic brings. I would add, I've drank Earth Tonic as a way of remineralizing my water for over a decade now. So it's a food grade material. We take Atlantic Ocean water, supersaturate that with Himalayan crystal salt. This is an ancient ocean water. We add Pacific sea minerals, Asian sea minerals, deep sea minerals, and then we add the biodynamic preparations to that, and then potentize it in a microbe maker to implode it to create a resonance in the material. And frankly, it's an amazing product, and you can use it as a foliar spray in a lot of different ways. But what in the compost tea recipe that we make, what we do is position it as the toolkit. And, again, it's that rhetorical question. What if you hire microbes to build a house and get them half the tools, right? This toolkit represents every element. The point being that every element has an enzyme potential. And as you can imagine, a bacteria doesn't have a mouth like we do, right? Doesn't chew up its dinner. What it does do is manufacture an enzyme. And from that scenario, the enzyme is the mode of action of the bacteria and also some fungi. So unless they have all of the elements at their capacity to utilize, they can't manufacture all of the enzyme spectrums that they're capable of. And if they can't, then that limits the system. Now, that's not something that we can see. It's really not something that we can measure with a high level of replicability. I can tell you anecdotally, I can see a higher level of activity in microbes, and even on some levels diversity when using compost tea with and without earth tonic, but I can't prove it, right? I don't know how to carry that burden of proof. So, in that spirit, that's where we started here, right? I'm offering this for what it's worth. Take it all with a grain of salt, prove it for yourself. Maybe I'm just trying to point it in a couple of different directions. But enzymes are really important to understand because, in big agriculture, a lot of the times when you have a hard pan soil, what you're using is an enzyme product to break that up. And that's what microbes make for free, right? So what would you rather do? Buy enzymes and apply them mechanically over time to perform a function, or introduce living organisms that are capable of manufacturing those enzymes and doing the work for you? And that's really a way into the question that we need to ask ourselves of why would we use compost tea? And it's only one of the components. But important to understand enzymes. They're specialty proteins. They just do a job of basically catalyzing a chemical reaction within biological environments. They almost all functions of the cell require enzymes. Living organisms, our body, etc., produces some level of enzymes. Not as much as they can utilize, but it's safe to say that the more we can supplement the enzyme posture within a living system, the higher rate of metabolic activity can occur. So in a lot of ways, the set of enzymes that are present determine how those metabolic pathways occur. So what that would mean is, let's say, and I'm going to make something up just make a discussion about it. Let's say the element yttrium was needed for a certain metabolic ability in a bacteria. Well, it may be that a similarly postured element with the same electron cloud structure, for example, could be used as an indirect pathway to the end of the living process. And our bodies and living organisms are unbelievably resilient and adept at taking the path of least resistance. So if they can't go one way, they got to go the other. But the one way they want to go is A, and then B times 10 is the amount of energy that it takes to perform the secondary pathway. Well, you can imagine that the organism in the system is being stressed. It doesn't have all of the components it needs to operate at peak efficiency. So, it really highlights the importance of the trace elements in this conversation. It's in a lot of ways, we would never be able to come up with all of the benefits that you would get out of trace elements. It doesn't define the success of the function. It defines the qualitative value of that, the nutrient density of the crop, for example. It's easy to grow a crop in hydroponics with 17 elements, but it doesn't take much to imagine a plant wants a lot more than that, right? Well, microbes' job is to deliver that, but it has to be there to be accomplished. So, you can see, like this bullet point, many critical enzymes have metals and other minerals at their core. These are called cofactors. So if the element, when it's used to manufacture an enzyme, is the center of the molecule, and then the complexity is built around it based on that structure. And if those elements are not present, then that function cannot take place. So, the enzyme pathways don't function in some capacities, and others they can find workarounds. And literally a lot of the afflictions that we deal with on the front lines of disease and pests and that kind of thing in agriculture are a result of just an inefficiency of the function of the system. And if you drill all the way down, what you're going to see is it lacks the enzyme capacity to express its metabolic potential. So, this really can't be understated in some ways. And you can see, you know, almost all pathways are, you know, functioning in this way. The dysfunction of cells dying, a lot of it is deemed on enzyme, the enzyme health of the system. So I found this interesting, and it had to do with, it was a cleaning product that Reed gave this explanation, but I thought it worthy of inclusion. You know, how do bacteria break down any molecule, or just, you know, how specific do they get? So, you know, bacteria have the capability of producing many different types of enzymes. They are living organisms that respond to their environment. In general, bacteria are capable of producing enzymes that degrade a wide variety of organic materials, such as fats, oils, cellulose, silane, proteins, and starches. It's important to note that all of these materials are polymers that must be reacted with more than one type of enzyme in order to be efficiently degraded to their basic building blocks. Nature provides a specific team of enzymes to attack each type of polymer. So for example, there's 3 different classes of enzymes: endocellulases, exocellulases, and biohydrolyses, that are required to degrade a cellulose polymer into basic glucose units. All 3 types of enzymes are referred to as cellulases, but each class attacks a specific structure or substructure of the polymer. So acting individually, none of the celluloses that are capable of efficiently degrading the polymer, but bacteria can produce the complete team of enzymes that are necessary to degrade and consume the organic materials present in their environment at any given time. Moreover, bacteria can produce multiple teams at the same time. So that's an extension of what we've been talking about, right? It's not only that all of the elements need to be there for bacteria and microbes to perform at their peak function. It's the fact that, one, the diversity of microbes needed to produce those enzymes needs to be present, and they need all of the tools they need to perform all of the functions that they need to perform collectively, not just individually. So you can see the power of this idea. If we're restricting the system, we are literally asking for the pest and disease manifestations that we chase around with toxic rescue chemistry. So this is a window into how you know, compost tea works to strengthen the plant from the inside. It's basically a bunch of teammates and trace elements that the plant has access to, that the microbes have access to, and plants can make their own antifreezes and their own antibiotics and their own, you know, amazing formalities when given the opportunity. And that's a lot of what you place through in flavor and shelf life and nutrient density and the qualitative value of food for people. In the end, all of this, as interesting as it is about growing people, right? Healthy people, I should say. You know, one of our taglines is growing healthy people, plants, and planet. And that's really central to this information. And this is one of those specific fulcrums that makes that real. And I thought this passage really did a good job at doing that. There's another resource called Enzyme Nutrition, and this is more for human health. And the premise of this book, and I'll save the detail for, you know, if you want to read it, but you know, I'm not worried about spoiling it. That's what books are for, right? Like, it's a meditation. It gives you what you can't accomplish in a conversation. But the premise of this book is essentially that we're born with a certain capacity to produce enzymes, and that when our body is exhausted of the ability to produce those enzymes, we die. So the effort of living nutrition and, you know, sprouting wheatgrass, whole foods, paying attention to our diet, not eating, you know, processed foods, all of that good stuff. The premise of it from this author's standpoint is that it makes our body work harder. And it's a very interesting concept, because what you get from living foods, particularly, and from whole foods secondarily, and not at all from processed foods, is an enzyme content from the food itself. And you're basically supplementing your body having to work harder to break it down. In other words, the food that you're eating has the capacity to break itself down on some level, which is kind of a cool concept. So even if it's not literally true that we die when we run out of enzymes, and it may very well be, it's a convincing case here, the concept of supplementing the energy that our body needs to work is a very easy to understand concept. And it actually has a lot of relevance in plant world. A lot of the products that we sold in Progressive Gardens weren't fertilizers. They're what I call biocatalysts or biostimulants, you know, anything in that category. It's basically plant extracts, amino acids, carbohydrates, vitamins, things like that, that have been concentrated into a product that allows the grower to supplement that to their garden. And it's feeding the plant what it has to make for itself before it has to make it for itself. And so think about that. It's kind of the parallel of what I was just saying about living foods for people. The more we can supplement what we want the plant what we don't want the plant to have to do, the more energy it can focus into what we do want it to do, produce more fruit, for example. If it's got to work so hard at all of these other processes, it's restricted in its ability to reproduce. And that reproductive activity is really the point of a plant, right? That's what the plant's desire is, and it's what we reap from the harvest. So hopefully that hits home, but that's kind of a dialogue that I always found very effective in progressive gardens, is getting people to think past just growing a plant directly. Let's supplement the plant with, you know, what it has to make and manufacture before it has to do that. And it says, thank you very much, and does more of what we want it to do. That in a nutshell is a lot of what progressive, you know, hydroponic, indoor, short cycle cultivation can be. And it's one of the reasons why you can get higher yields and out of smaller areas. Once you kind of get past the acreage realm with an individual, you can't really address the level of energy it takes to bring this to the crop. So the question is, you know, at what point does the scale of the operation outpace our ability to influence the qualitative value of what we're growing? And, you know, I have a very high level of interest in that, and I don't know all the answers, and I never will, but I don't know enough to tell you case studies yet. But one of the things I intend to do as we go forward here is to really work on that in the literal sense and produce farming modules that, you know, for somebody that wants to get into growing their landscape. We do that with our Farmer Yard project. You can look at farm-a-yard.com. That's a project that I work on that takes 1/3 of an acre or less. And it's been proven by several different people that you can produce $75,000 in revenue on 1/3 of an acre of land. You know, go look at Curtis Stone or, you know, any of those people out there doing this for a living at this point. So, you know, there's a lot of potential there. But Enzymes, you know, work through kind of a lock and key. You can kind of see this diagram illustrates it pretty well. You know, you've got the enzyme, it fits the substrate, and when that hole is made, the catalyst to the next step is produced, and the result is 2 different materials that were needed for a very specific reason. Without the ability of the body or the soil food web or the microbe or whatever we're talking about to produce that enzyme, this system is limited in its ability to produce these materials. And you know, it's worth looking at the complexity. This is a protein, an enzyme. The organic chemistry view of an enzyme, and then just, you know, take the complexity of that in for a minute. It's unbelievable. So, you know, with those understandings, you know, why would somebody want to grow compost tea? Well, you grow better plants, you know, and that's the focus. You do that through a combination of growing living microbes, soil microbes, and producing perfect plant food out of that process. So it's really a 2-for-1 that is a value add, and that allows you to grow your soil in a very quick way relative to making physical compost, hauling it out and having to wait till it's finished, that sort of thing. It makes soil smarter, right? Plants feed the soil through what's called exudates. I'm going to give you some images of that here in a minute. Up to 70% of photosynthesis is conducted to push food through the roots for microbes to reciprocate. So all of that energy is wasted when living microbes aren't in the system. They're literally teammates. And, you know, I say it often, this is a really good way to create a pest control or disease control program from the inside of plants, right? You strengthen their ability to withstand these pathogens. In a lot of ways, the pathogen is just an indicator of unhealth and imbalance and deficiency. So there's a lot of really valid reasons to brew compost tea. I want to show you some pictures. You know, this is a side-by-side that I've replicated a number of times. It was a pack of mescaline greens to ocean forest potting soil, if you ever heard of that. Pretty good soil. Put them in a flat. I had a flat with holes inside of a flat without holes, and just sowed the mescaline seeds directly, put a humidity dome on them, grew them out. I can't remember, 2-3 weeks, maybe not that long. And I used compost tea on the left and not on the right one. And then what I did is I stopped watering them, right? And this is after about 4 days. So the one that got the compost tea weekly over time on the left, you could make a salad out of it. The one on the right was completely desiccated. The only difference was compost tea was added to the left and not the right. So, you know, and again, this was not a one-time thing. I've done this many different times, and you can project this into your landscape as well. You know, I've talked to plenty of people out of buying cistern-based irrigation systems, simply by giving us some time to show them the fact that they didn't need to irrigate. It's how I started my lawn care company, actually. We had a drought year 6-8 years ago, I can't remember now, and I was aggressively giving compost tea to all kinds of landscapers, and this one guy who was kind of ripe for a transition in his synthetic lawn care company, you know, was using the tea and noticed results, you know, far and away better in the lawns that he was using the tea in and not the other, was based on the drought. And that was kind of his moment of, good gracious, that was his moment of realizing that this is not just the right thing to do, it actually functionally makes sense. So here's some images of those exudates. You know, this is a corn plant on the right and a buckwheat plant. This is a better image. That little globule right there is the plant pushing sugars out of its roots. And there's an intelligence there. If the plant's deficient in boron, it can push a boron cycler meal out of its roots and attract the right guys, right? Is that measurable? Difficult. But it's absolutely real in regards to the give and take of the symbiotic relationship of microbes to a plant. So this is just an image of what that looks like. And, you know, a couple graphics. You know, the term rhizosphere is basically the interface of the physical plant with the soil around it. And it's an extremely complex environment that, you know, it's going to be real difficult for us to get any kind of firm understanding of how it all works. But we do know a lot. So, you know, you can see, you know, this is a rhizobial bacteria, you know, that you may have heard works through beans and different things like that. And you can see the direct penetration of the microbe, and there's even gene transcription. I learned the other day that spider mites can transcribe genes. That's one of the reasons why they're so adept at gaining resiliency towards pesticides and things like that. So it's kind of incredible what happens in the rhizosphere. But safe to say, you know, without going into too much detail, we need to have a high level of respect for this. You know, you can see, you know, the amino acids, things are pushed out, things are pushed in. There's a give and take, there's a bait and switch, there's all types of dynamic processes happening in the rhizosphere. And, you know, on the microscopic level, forget the nano level, if you will, this is a famous image of a parasitic nematode being captured by beneficial fungi. So you're going to get this pest control for free when the soil is alive. It's not about trying to go out and kill the nematodes. It's about trying to bring balance, you know, and that's really a way of kind of simplifying it. Turns out that most nematodes, I've been told upwards of 90 to 99% of nematodes are beneficial. The reason people believe that they're bad is because they see their plant being harmed from the parasitic ones. And then the effort is to go kill the parasitic ones, and we've killed anything else that's going to have any ability to balance it out, like the fungi in the last slide. This is an image of what happens to grubs when beneficial nematodes are present. So rather than taking a pesticide out to try to kill the grubs directly, which is going to kill everything else in the soil and stick us in the vicious cycle, we can rely on these beneficial microbes over time, and even through direct inoculation of nematodes themselves. You can buy them as a product, and they work very well. It's like putting a bunch of sharks in the kiddie pool. You know, you can get rid of the problem, but if you haven't introduced all of the other organisms with it, you got to do the nematodes every single year, because they're going to die off once they've eaten all of the grubs and whatever is alive in your soil. So when you have the food web intact, you can sustain those beneficial nematodes you started with, and you don't even have to add them ever again. The soil has taken on a life of its own, literally. So, you know, pest control, disease control, you know, a lot of the tea organisms, Bacillus subtilis being a good one, are, you know, directly relevant to fungicidal, bactericide, pesticidal actions. But the true potential of this is to achieve diversity in your soil, so you don't even need to deal with that directly. It also produces some pretty amazing results. You know, you can see the top here. This client won the worst lawn in Wilmington contest we had the 3 years we did this, and within 8 months we had, you know, they weren't embarrassed anymore, right? So this was monthly applications, a gallon per 500 square feet. This is an example that's, I think, even more impressive. On a school ball field. This was my business partner's son's high school, and you can actually see the beach. You know, we do live at the beach, and you know, with applications of tea after 8 months, you can actually see the soil that we grew. You know, we didn't bring that soil in; we grew it, and that's how this works, right? So I imagine seeing images like that, you can get an idea of the power of this material. And I wanted to give you a couple of quick videos of some testimony and we have a lot of these testimonials, but these are two that were pretty cool. Check this out.
All right, so how's the compost tea working for you?
It's pretty great. I was really surprised.
Very nice. I like flower.
And everyone was talking about it, and I kind of didn't believe it, but I was surprised. We came back for more.
Okay, great. And what were you using it on? And what did you notice when you started using it?
We put it on the tomatoes, and the tomatoes, one plant before didn't have any tomatoes or flowers. And within like 2 or 3 days it had flowers, and now we have little tomatoes.
Very cool.
And I put it on a fern that I just got a little while ago, and it exploded too.
Oh my gosh. That is so cool. Thank you guys so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So yeah, you can see people are quite surprised. This woman especially. Check this out.
Well, my husband brought us home, and I immediately watered all my houseplants. I had like 20 of them, okay? And then like 4 days later, I noticed new growth on half of them. And like they're greener, and they look happier, and it was like amazing to me. So I'm just really excited about this. Whatever it is, I'd like to know more about it. But anyway, it's an excellent product.
Great. That's always a trip to me, you know, is people in the end, they really don't care how it works most of the time, and that's not surprising. You know, you can't expect everyone to put their science cap on when they graduated, you know, long ago. But the reality is the excitement that it generates when people see it work. And then what happens is exactly what she said. She came back and she's like, you know, I'd like to learn more about it. You know, if I tried to you know, and what we do in our garden center is we give people a compost tea card, and it was good for 5 gallons whenever they wanted to use it. You know, it's a very cost-effective means of, it's highly profitable for the dealer. It's highly valuable to the customer. And you can't buy it from a shelf, right? So it's also foreign to most people. So we would brew the tea out perpetually, as I described earlier, and then give people a compost tea card if they signed up for a newsletter or they made a big purchase or something like that. You know, we'd use some kind of tokens and, you know, give people a gallon and just kind of keep it real simple. This is alive, and some of the analogies we talked about. And if they were interested, we'd spend some time, but most people would just take it and say, thank you very much. You know, it's free value. And they'd go home and they use it on their house plants or whatever, like you've seen these people describe. And they'd come back in and they'd say, well, why did that work? Right. And we did that from the get-go in some respects, but the effectiveness of that is viral, because rather than try to sell them that compost tea card for something that they may be afraid of, I mean, you know, they may be using hand sanitizer every time they touch a door, but to see it work in a positive way was really an influential experience for a lot of people. And you know, that's what we try to do with my wholesale company now, rather than doing it on the front lines. You know, we offer that package to garden centers. So if anybody out there knows a garden center owner, or you have one in your area, we always love referrals. But this stuff is really incredible. So I say that I'm really kind of careful not to push my own stuff. I think it's really amazing, don't get me wrong, but compost tea is something that you can brew out of your own compost. It is the key is to have the diversity of microbes in your compost to begin with, because if they're not there, they can't parachute in, they can't just manifest, you know. So it is really important to inoculate your pile with something that you know is diverse. From that point on, as you finish compost, and let's say you're making more, you know, you could put 20 gallons aside to brew tea with, instead of, you know, putting it on your field, and just grow your microbes up out of your own compost. And what you can also do is, out of the finished stuff, grow up the microbes and put it back on your compost pile, and speed the process off of the decomposition in your compost pile. Because make the connection, you're growing more microbes in tea than the compost could ever produce on our own. You know, we are outpacing nature here with a natural principle, and that's what makes this so valuable. So, you know, I hope, you know, people are already doing this out there. If you have any questions about how to do it yourself, you know, I'm an open book in that regard. And, you know, at the least, go scratch the forest floor and ask for your buddy's compost, and bring all the diversity, get some worm castings, and put all of this in your pile. And, you know, you can get down the road in terms of the effectiveness of how it works. And, you know, we discussed in depth last week about how to know it's working. So if you wanted to reference that, if you weren't present, feel free. So, you know, some takeaways. You know, compost tea is not defined. I think that's a really important point, because if you have an experience, if you went to a big box store and bought their compost and tried to, you know, and did a biological analysis of it, you would understand how deficient they are biologically. I've done that with a lot of bulk compost products, and a lot of them have lesionous nematodes and urea and all kinds of different processed material. They are not humus. Compost is only really compost when it's in a humic form that is the end result of diverse biological decomposition. So don't be fooled by products that can say the word compost. An easy way to do that, as we talked about last week, is just to ask your source of compost for their biological analysis, for example. If they can't produce it, doesn't mean it's a bad product. It might mean they hadn't done it. But if they're not aware of microbes, safe bet they're not making a really high quality product. So don't get burned by that. And once you kind of get hip to this conversation, it's pretty simple to seek out the people that are doing the right things. And broadly speaking, compost tea is a living solution, kind of a double entendre there. It's a liquid solution, but it's also a solution for pest disease, all sorts of issues that we chase around and spend money on and pay for in more ways than one with our health. So, hopefully we've gotten across the value of compost tea, and I look forward to next week. We're going to be talking about compost tea again in the context of how to brew it, different recipes, different brewing, things like that, different brewers. And after that, we're going to move more into the to the energetic realm, where we'll talk about biodynamic agriculture and a lot of really cool far out stuff. So, thanks for hanging with me today. And if there are any questions, I am happy to engage them.
All right, yeah, it's Q&A time, guys. Hit that Q&A button to ask your questions. I would like to remind you, tv.permaethos.com to watch the previous episodes, or you can head to learn.permaethos.com, support the show. You get access to the slides and all of the previous episodes, as well as you can download them. And so let's begin the quiz.